I never thought saying no to my own daughter would expose the kind of person she'd become. But that dinner changed everything. I'm a single parent, and for most of my life, everything I did revolved around my daughter. From the moment she was born, I made a promise to myself that no matter how hard things got, she would never feel like she came second to anything. Her other parent left when she was still young, so it was always just the two of us against the world. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and for a long time, that felt like enough. I worked 2 jobs for years just to keep us afloat. There were nights I came home exhausted, hands aching, barely able to stand. But I still helped with homework, still listened to her talk about her day, still showed up to every school event I could. I skipped vacations, wore the same old clothes year after year, and put my own dreams on hold because her future mattered more than mine. Every dollar I saved, every sacrifice I made, was with her in mind. As she grew older, things got better financially, but never easy. I was careful with money because I had to be. I learned the hard way that stability doesn't come from luck. It comes from discipline. The savings I built didn't happen overnight. That money was meant to protect us both. Emergency funds, retirement, something to fall back on when life inevitably took a turn. To me, $200,000 wasn't just a number. It was years of restraint, missed opportunities, and quiet determination. My daughter grew up knowing I'd always support her. I helped pay for her education, covered her rent when she struggled, and never once made her feel like a burden. When she failed, I encouraged her. When she succeeded, I celebrated louder than anyone else. I trusted her completely. I believed I had raised her with values: gratitude, responsibility, respect. That's why I never questioned her intentions when she came to me asking for help. She was my daughter. The little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. The teenager who promised she'd take care of me one day. I never imagined a world where I'd have to protect myself from her. Before the money came between us, there was love. Real love. Or at least, that's what I thought. I believed our bond was stronger than finances, stronger than disagreements, stronger than entitlement. I believed that saying no would be understood, not as rejection, but as a parent doing what they believed was right. Looking back now, I realize that trust can quietly turn into expectation. And love, when taken for granted, can become something else entirely. I just didn't know how much had already changed until I said no. The conversation didn't start the way I expected. There was no small talk, no catching up, no warmth. She came over one evening and barely sat down before getting to the point, like she'd rehearsed it on the way. Her posture was confident, almost rigid, and there was a seriousness in her eyes that made my stomach tighten. She told me she needed $200,000. Not help, not guidance, not a loan. She said it plainly, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I laughed softly, waiting for her to clarify or backtrack, but she didn't. She just stared at me, waiting for my response, already convinced the answer would be yes. When I asked why, she launched into an explanation that sounded impressive on the surface, but fell apart the more she spoke. She called it an investment opportunity, something about partnering with someone she knew, a business idea that was time-sensitive and couldn't wait. The details were slippery. One minute it was about real estate, the next it was a startup. Then it became about securing her future so she wouldn't end up struggling forever. Every time I tried to pin her down, the story shifted just enough to avoid real answers. I asked basic questions: what the business was, who else was involved, what the risks were. Each question seemed to irritate her more than the last. Her tone sharpened, and she accused me of interrogating her instead of supporting her. She said I was focusing on the negatives instead of believing in her potential. That was the first red flag. I wasn't saying no. I was just asking her to explain. But to her, even hesitation felt like betrayal. Then came the emotional angle. She reminded me of how hard her life had been, how she'd struggled to find her footing, how unfair the world was to her generation. She spoke like she'd been carrying a weight no one else could possibly understand. And maybe she had, but the way she framed it felt calculated. She wasn't sharing pain. She was presenting evidence, building a case. She told me that if I truly loved her, I wouldn't let her miss this chance. That parents were supposed to help their children succeed, not hold them back with fear. She compared me to other parents, friends of hers, whose families had helped them buy houses, start businesses, travel. She didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. If I didn't help her, I was failing as a parent. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of it. She leaned forward and lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. She said this money would change everything. That she'd finally be stable, independent, that she wouldn't need to rely on me anymore. The irony didn't escape me. She was asking for more money than I'd ever spent on myself, all in the name of independence. When I suggested a smaller amount, her face hardened instantly. She said it wouldn't be enough, that anything less than $200,000 would be pointless. When I asked why it had to be that exact amount, she couldn't explain it, only that she'd already calculated it and knew what she needed. The certainty in her voice wasn't confidence. It was entitlement. Then she played the guilt card. She reminded me of everything I'd ever promised her, of all the times I said I'd always be there. She asked if those words meant anything now. She said she never would have asked if she had another option, even though nothing in her story suggested she'd tried to find one. She spoke as if I were her last resort, even while dismissing every alternative I offered. At one point, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "You're just sitting on that money. What good is it doing you?" I didn't answer right away. I was too stunned. That money represented decades of work, of saying no to myself so I could say yes to her. To hear it reduced to something idle, something wasted, made my chest tighten. But she didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and didn't care. Her urgency escalated as the conversation went on. She said the opportunity wouldn't wait, that people were counting on her, that if I delayed, I'd be the reason everything fell apart. She spoke faster, her voice rising slightly, her words overlapping mine whenever I tried to speak. It felt less like a conversation and more like a pitch, one designed to corner me emotionally before I had time to think. I realized then that she wasn't prepared for resistance. Every expression, every argument assumed compliance. She had already decided I would give her the money. She was just explaining why. The idea that I might say no didn't fit into her narrative. And the more I hesitated, the more aggressive her persuasion became. When I asked her to put together a proper plan, something in writing, she sighed dramatically. She accused me of not trusting her, of treating her like a child. She said paperwork was for people who didn't believe in each other. That hurt, because trust had never been the issue. Responsibility was. By the end of the conversation, I felt drained. Not because I'd refused, because I hadn't yet, but because I could feel the invisible line forming between us. On one side was her expectation. On the other was my reality. And standing between them was a sum of money that had somehow become a test of love, loyalty, and worth. As she stood to leave, she said quietly, "I just thought you'd be on my side." That sentence followed me long after the door closed. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't about an investment, or a business, or even money. It was about control. I didn't answer her right away. After she left that night, I barely slept. I replayed every word, every look, every shift in her tone. By morning, my chest felt heavy, but my mind was clear. I wasn't confused about what I felt anymore. I was conflicted because I cared. But caring didn't mean surrendering reason. When she came back a few days later, I made a deliberate effort to stay calm. I didn't want this to turn into a fight. I told her I'd thought carefully about what she'd asked. I explained that I couldn't give her $200,000. I said it slowly, clearly, without anger or accusation. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't a rejection of her, but a boundary around something I'd spent my entire life protecting. I explained what that money represented, that it wasn't sitting idle, as she'd suggested, but earmarked for security, retirement, emergencies, stability. I reminded her that life had taught me how quickly things could unravel, and how dangerous it was to put everything at risk for something uncertain. I told her I believed in her ability, but belief didn't erase risk. She listened without interrupting, her expression carefully neutral. That almost worried me more than anger would have. I told her I wasn't shutting the door entirely. I offered alternatives. I said I could help her review her idea, connect her with financial advisors, or help her create a real plan. I offered to contribute a smaller amount, something I could afford without jeopardizing my future. I even offered non-financial help, time, guidance, support. Everything except the one thing she wanted in full. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she sighed. Not with relief, but with disappointment so controlled it felt rehearsed. She said she was hurt, but her voice was flat. She said she had expected more faith from me. She said she'd hoped I would be different. There was no yelling, no tears, just carefully chosen words designed to sound reasonable while landing like quiet accusations. She told me she understood my fear, but that fear was exactly why people like me never got ahead. That's when I felt the coldness settle in. Her eyes no longer searched my face for understanding. They slid past me, as if I were already no longer part of the conversation. When I reiterated that I wasn't abandoning her, that I was still willing to help in other ways, she waved it off. She said advice wouldn't pay bills. Connections wouldn't open doors. She said she didn't need guidance. She needed capital. I tried to explain that real support sometimes meant saying no, that I couldn't sacrifice my own stability to prove my love, that if the plan was solid, it should survive scrutiny and time. Each sentence seemed to push her further away. Then came the anger. Quiet, contained, but unmistakable. She said she wasn't angry, but her jaw tightened. Her words became shorter. She stopped calling me by the familiar name she'd always used and switched to something formal, distant. She said she appreciated my honesty, but the way she said it made honesty sound like betrayal. She stood up before I realized the conversation was ending. There was no dramatic exit, no final argument. Just a sudden emotional withdrawal, so complete it felt like a door slamming without a sound. At the door, she paused. For a second, I thought she might turn back, soften, say something real. Instead, she said, "I won't forget this." That sentence chilled me more than any shouting ever could have. After that, everything changed. She stopped calling. When I reached out, her replies were brief, polite, and delayed. She no longer shared details about her life. When I asked how things were going, she said fine and changed the subject. The warmth we'd always had was gone, replaced by a careful distance that felt intentional. I questioned myself constantly. I wondered if I'd been too rigid, too cautious, too afraid. I wondered if I'd mistaken entitlement for ambition, or if I was letting my own fears dictate her future. But every time I revisited the facts, the answer was the same. Giving her that money wouldn't have been love. It would have been surrender. What hurt most wasn't her disappointment. It was how quickly she adjusted to life without me at the center of it. As if my role had always been conditional. As if support only mattered when it came with a check attached. Days passed in silence. Then, just as I was starting to accept the distance, she reached out. Her message was unexpectedly warm. She said she'd been thinking, that she didn't want money to come between us. She invited me to dinner, called it a special night, said she wanted to clear the air. She even added a heart emoji, something she hadn't done in weeks. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Part of me felt relief, hope. Another part of me felt uneasy. The shift was too sudden, too clean. But I told myself I was being paranoid. She was my daughter. Maybe she'd processed her emotions. Maybe she'd realized I was acting out of care, not control. I agreed to the dinner. And that was my mistake. The silence didn't start dramatically. There was no slammed door, no angry message, no final accusation. It arrived quietly, settling into my days like an unwanted presence. The first morning after our conversation, I checked my phone out of habit. Nothing. No good morning text, no follow-up question, no acknowledgement of what we'd talked about. I told myself she was just busy. People needed time to cool off. That was normal. By the second day, the quiet felt heavier. I replayed our conversation again and again, searching for the moment where I might have pushed too hard or chosen the wrong words. I wondered if my calm had come across as cold, if my logic had sounded dismissive instead of protective. I knew I hadn't raised my voice, but maybe that had been the problem. Maybe she'd needed to see how much it cost me to say no. Guilt has a way of rewriting memories. By midday, I started questioning things I'd been certain about only hours earlier. Maybe I had been too cautious. Maybe I'd let fear dictate my decision. I thought about her sitting alone somewhere, feeling rejected, convinced I didn't believe in her. That image hurt more than I expected it to. I picked up my phone several times, typed out messages, then erased them. I love you. I'm proud of you. Let's talk. Each version felt either too weak or too defensive. I didn't want to chase her, but I also didn't want the distance to harden into something permanent. That night, I barely slept. The house felt too quiet. Every sound, a passing car, the ticking clock, felt amplified. I wondered if this was how it would be from now on. Separate lives, polite updates, a relationship reduced to holidays and obligatory check-ins. On the third day, the doubt became louder than the silence. I found myself justifying her behavior, making excuses for the things she'd said. I told myself she was under pressure. That ambition can come out wrong when fear is involved. That maybe I hadn't prepared her for disappointment. Parenting doesn't come with instructions for moments like this. Moments where love collides with boundaries. I even opened my financial records, staring at the numbers as if they might suddenly tell me I was wrong. I imagined what giving her the money would look like. The relief on her face, the warmth returning, the sense of being needed again. It was tempting, not because I believed it was wise, but because it would have been easier emotionally. That's the part no one talks about. Saying no doesn't end when the conversation does. It lingers, it echoes, it tests you in the quiet moments, when no one is watching and there's nothing left to defend yourself against but your own thoughts. By the afternoon, I felt worn down. The confidence I'd had in my decision was still there, but it was buried beneath layers of second-guessing. I wondered if this was the price of setting boundaries with someone you love. Constant uncertainty, the fear of becoming the villain in their story. Then my phone buzzed. For a split second, I was afraid to look. When I did, her name was on the screen. The message was short, but its tone stopped me cold. She said she'd been thinking a lot, that she didn't want money to damage our relationship, that she understood my position better now. She said she missed me. Then she invited me to dinner, called it a special night, said she wanted us to talk in person, to clear the air, to reconnect. There was no mention of the money, no hint of tension, just warmth. I read the message 3 times, searching for hidden meaning. It sounded sincere, almost gentle. She even apologized, briefly, carefully, for how emotional things had gotten. That alone felt like a breakthrough. Relief washed over me before caution had a chance to catch up. I responded right away, telling her I'd love to have dinner, that I missed her too. As soon as I sent it, I felt something loosen in my chest. The last few days had taken more out of me than I realized. The idea that we could move past this, that we could talk, maybe even laugh again, felt like oxygen. But as the evening went on, a small unease crept in. The shift was too clean, too sudden. 3 days of silence followed by warmth and reconciliation. I told myself I was overthinking it. Not everything had to be a test or a trap. She was my daughter, not an adversary. Still, the timing nagged at me. That night, I thought about what the dinner might be like. I imagined a quiet restaurant, a shared meal, honest conversation. I pictured her explaining her idea more clearly, maybe even acknowledging the risks. I hoped she'd understand that my refusal had come from love, not doubt. I also worried about what I'd say if she brought the money up again. I rehearsed responses in my head, trying to balance firmness with compassion. I promised myself I wouldn't be guilted into changing my mind. But I also promised myself I'd listen. Sleep came easier that night, but not peacefully. I dreamed of conversations that never quite reached resolution, of smiles that faded too quickly. I woke up with a sense of anticipation, tangled with something darker I couldn't quite name. Looking back now, I recognize that feeling for what it was. Instinct. At the time, I ignored it. I wanted reconciliation more than I wanted to be cautious. I wanted to believe that love could smooth over everything, that one dinner could reset what had been damaged. I didn't know then that the silence wasn't distance. It was preparation. The restaurant she chose wasn't one we'd ever been to together. That alone should have meant something. It was upscale, but impersonal. The kind of place designed to impress rather than invite comfort. Soft lighting, polished silverware, neutral music that filled silence without warmth. Everything felt curated, intentional. As I walked in, I had the strange sensation of stepping into a scene already in progress. She stood as soon as she saw me, smiling wide, almost too wide. The smile reached her mouth, but not her eyes. She hugged me, brief and stiff, then pulled back and said how good it was to see me, how glad she was that I came. Her voice was light, carefully modulated, as if she were performing rather than speaking. That's when I noticed the table. It wasn't set for 2. There were already several people seated. Some I recognized, others I didn't. Her husband sat beside her, polite but distant, offering a quick nod instead of the usual warmth. Across from him were 2 of her friends, both dressed sharply, phones face down on the table like props. Further down sat an older couple I vaguely recognized as distant relatives, and next to them, a man I'd never seen before, flipping through the menu with professional detachment. I hesitated just for a moment. She noticed. "Oh, I hope you don't mind," she said quickly, her smile tightening. "I thought it would be nice to make this a family thing. Less awkward. You know?" The explanation came too fast, as if she'd been waiting for the question. I told myself I was being sensitive. People bring guests to dinner all the time. Still, the chair she guided me to felt oddly placed, slightly apart from hers, closer to the center of the table than beside her. It made me feel exposed, like a guest of honor who hadn't asked for the role. As I sat down, conversations resumed with forced enthusiasm. Compliments were exchanged. Someone commented on the food. Someone else joked about traffic. It all sounded normal, but the timing was off, like everyone was waiting for cues. I noticed how often people glanced at my daughter before speaking, as if checking for approval. She was the most polished I'd ever seen her. Every word was measured. Every laugh arrived a second too late. She asked how I'd been, how my health was, how work was going. All questions she already knew the answers to. When I responded, she nodded attentively, but her eyes drifted around the table, monitoring reactions. The waiter arrived, and she took charge immediately, ordering appetizers for everyone without asking. She framed it as generosity, but it felt like control. When the waiter asked if we were celebrating something, she laughed lightly and said, "Just family." The word landed oddly. As the food arrived, the atmosphere grew thicker. The table filled with expensive dishes, beautifully arranged, almost excessive. She made a point of insisting I try everything, telling others how much I loved certain flavors, as if narrating my preferences for an audience. Each gesture of kindness felt amplified, performative. I caught her husband watching me closely, his expression unreadable. The unfamiliar man across the table, still silent, observed everything with quiet focus, occasionally scribbling something on a small notepad before slipping it back into his jacket. No one explained who he was. Conversation drifted towards success stories. One of her friends mentioned a recent investment. Another spoke about buying property. The older couple nodded approvingly, chiming in about how important it was to support the next generation. Each comment felt like it was circling something, warming up before landing. I smiled when appropriate, but unease settled in my chest. It wasn't any single thing. It was the accumulation, the way my daughter avoided sitting too close to me, the way she touched my arm only when others were watching, the way she kept steering the conversation toward money, opportunity, and sacrifice without directly naming any of it. At one point, she raised her glass and tapped it gently, just loud enough to draw attention. "I just want to say," she began, glancing around the table, "how grateful I am for family, for support, for parents who teach us strength, even when it's hard." Her eyes met mine for half a second, long enough to feel intentional, then moved on. Everyone nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I forced a smile, my pulse quickening. This didn't feel like reconciliation. It felt like framing. She continued, praising my discipline, my values, my sacrifices. Each compliment felt like it was building towards something, laying groundwork. The warmth in her voice sounded practiced, as if she'd repeated these words in front of a mirror until they landed just right. I realized then that she wasn't nervous. She was prepared. As the meal progressed, I noticed subtle changes in how people looked at me. Less like a guest, more like a subject. The man with the notepad finally spoke, asking me polite questions about my career, my approach to finances, my beliefs about helping adult children. His tone was neutral, but the questions were pointed. I answered carefully, still trying to give the situation the benefit of the doubt. I told myself this was just conversation. Still, my daughter watched closely, her expression tightening whenever I said something that didn't align with whatever narrative she was building. When dessert arrived, she leaned toward me and smiled again. That same too perfect smile. "I'm really glad you came," she said softly. "This means a lot to me." There was something in her voice then. Not affection, not gratitude, but relief. As if a piece had finally fallen into place. That's when I knew. This dinner wasn't about healing. It was about positioning. And whatever she had planned next, I was already sitting exactly where she wanted me. The moment arrived quietly. No dramatic announcement, no raised voice, just a subtle shift in posture. A glance exchanged between my daughter and the unfamiliar man at the table. He cleared his throat and placed his napkin neatly beside his plate, as is preparing for business rather than dessert. My daughter straightened in her chair. "I wanted tonight to be special," she said, her voice warm, practiced. "Not just dinner, but clarity." That word again. She gestured toward the man across from me. "This is Daniel. He's a financial consultant. He's been helping me structure some things." Daniel smiled politely and slid a thin folder onto the table. It stopped directly in front of me. No one else spoke. "I thought it would be easier," she continued, "to talk about this with everyone present. That way there are no misunderstandings. No emotions clouding things." My heart began to pound, not with anger, but with a growing sense of realization. This wasn't a reconciliation dinner. It was a presentation. Daniel opened the folder and gently turned it so I could see the first page. Charts, projections, bullet points. My name appeared more than once. "This outlines a proposed financial arrangement," he said calmly. "An advance, technically, structured to support your daughter's future ventures." Advance. I looked at my daughter. She nodded encouragingly, like a manager waiting for approval. She began explaining how the money wouldn't be given, but reallocated. How it would be a family-backed investment. How the structure would protect everyone involved. Her words flowed easily now. Confident, polished. This was the version of the conversation she'd wanted all along. She hadn't invited me to dinner to talk. She'd invited me to comply. As she spoke, others at the table joined in. One of her friends commented on how parents help their children all the time. The older couple nodded sympathetically, saying this was how legacies were built. Even her husband spoke, carefully, about shared futures and long-term vision. I realized then that I was surrounded. This wasn't pressure from my daughter alone. It was pressure by design. I picked up the folder and flipped through it slowly. The numbers were laid out clearly. $200,000, released upfront. No clear repayment terms. No defined ownership. Just trust. My trust. What happens if it fails? I asked. There was a pause. A brief one, but noticeable. Daniel answered instead of her. He said risk was inherent in any opportunity. That belief was the foundation of progress. That family support often required sacrifice. My daughter watched my face closely, waiting for something to give. Then she said it. I didn't want to do this publicly, she sighed, loud enough for everyone to hear. But you left me no choice. The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they were calculated. She turned to the table. I asked for help privately. I explained everything, and I was told no. Not because it wasn't possible, but because it was inconvenient. She looked at me then, eyes sharp, no warmth left to mask them. I needed everyone here to understand that. The room shifted. Suddenly, the glances I'd felt earlier made sense. This wasn't a dinner. It was a verdict. She framed herself as patient, reasonable, hurt. She spoke about feeling unsupported, about how hard it was to chase dreams without backing, about how rejection from a parent cut deeper than anything else. Each sentence was carefully constructed to sound vulnerable, while quietly placing blame squarely on me. Then came the final layer. One of her friends casually mentioned how inspiring it was that my daughter was brave enough to have this conversation recorded. For transparency. Recorded. My stomach dropped. I turned to my daughter. Recorded? She didn't deny it. She lifted her phone from beside her plate and placed it face up on the table. The red dot was unmistakable. For clarity, she said, so no one can twist what's said later. That was the moment. Something in me went still. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about leverage. She wasn't asking anymore. She was documenting, building a narrative, creating evidence, not for protection, but for pressure. I looked around the table. At the people nodding along, at the man waiting for my signature, at my daughter, who wasn't nervous, wasn't uncertain, wasn't even angry. She was confident, because she believed she had already won. I closed the folder and slid it back toward Daniel. I'm not signing anything, I said calmly. The air went cold. My daughter's smile flickered. Not gone, but strained. I don't think you understand, she said. This isn't just about me. People are counting on this. I nodded. I understand perfectly. That's why the answer is still no. Her voice sharpened. So you're willing to embarrass me? In front of everyone? I met her gaze. You invited them, not me. Silence followed. Thick, uncomfortable. The older couple shifted uncomfortably. Her friends avoided eye contact. Daniel quietly began gathering his papers. My daughter stared at me, like I'd broken a script she'd rehearsed too many times to abandon. "You always do this," she snapped, suddenly, the mask slipping. "You hold the power and pretend it's protection. You'd rather control than help." There it was. Not disappointment, resentment. She didn't want support. She wanted access. And my refusal wasn't just a boundary. It was an obstacle. "I raised you to be capable," I said quietly, "not entitled." The word landed hard. Her face hardened completely. "Then don't be surprised when I stop asking." I stood slowly, my hands steady despite everything. "That already happened," I said. No one stopped me as I walked away from the table. No one spoke. The recording continued, capturing the sound of my chair scraping back. The silence I left behind. As I stepped outside into the night air, one truth settled heavily in my chest. The dinner didn't expose me. It exposed her. And once you see someone clearly like that, you can never unsee it. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, letting my thoughts settle. My mind replayed everything that had just happened. The polished smiles, the rehearsed compliments, the recording, the folder, the subtle glares from strangers. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the pounding of my heart. But underneath it all, a calm clarity emerged. I wasn't going to let fear or manipulation dictate my actions any longer. When I returned to the table, I moved deliberately, letting my presence fill the room. No rushing, no flinching, just slow, measured steps. My daughter's smile faltered the moment she saw me. That too-perfect mask she had worn for the evening finally cracked, ever so slightly. "I need to say something," I began, my voice calm but firm. "I came here tonight because you asked for a conversation, not a presentation. I did not come here to be manipulated or ambushed." The room fell silent immediately. Everyone froze, mid-bite, mid-sentence. Her friends, her husband, the older couple, even Daniel, the consultant, all looked at me with wide eyes. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding its breath for what would come next. "You orchestrated this dinner like it was some kind of performance," I continued, scanning the table. "You invited people to watch. You documented our conversation. You created pressure and guilt as if they were evidence of your right to force me into giving you what you wanted. That is not a discussion. That is manipulation. And manipulation will not work on me. Not now, not ever." My daughter's hand twitched over the folder on the table. She opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance to continue the rehearsed lines she had been using all night. "I'm your parent, not your audience. I've spent years supporting you, guiding you, teaching you what it means to be responsible, to make choices, to face consequences. You don't get to use people, tricks, or recordings to get what you want. That is not love. That is not ambition. That is entitlement." A murmur ran through the table. One of her friends tried to interject, but I raised a hand gently but firmly. "No interruptions. I want this to be clear, and I want it to be heard." I took a breath and leaned forward slightly, looking her in the eyes. "You came tonight pretending to reconcile, pretending to be grateful, pretending to respect me. But everything you did was calculated. You thought if you smiled enough, praised enough, and surrounded me with witnesses, I'd bend. I will not bend, and this ends tonight." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between loyalty and embarrassment. The older couple whispered something to each other, glancing at my daughter. Daniel quietly began closing the folder, sensing that the tide of control had shifted. "I am willing to help you," I said, my tone softening slightly, but only slightly. "I am willing to offer guidance, advice, and support where it is appropriate, but I will not give in to pressure, manipulation, or public shaming. Those are not tools of respect or gratitude. They are tools of control, and they have no place between us." My daughter's face turned pale. The rehearsed calm vanished entirely. Her hands fumbled over the table. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. "I was just trying to—" I shook my head gently. "Trying to what? Make me feel guilty? Make yourself look right while undermining our trust? I see what you tried to do, and it won't work. Not on me, and not in a relationship built on real love and respect." Her friends looked down at their hands. Her husband's jaw tightened. The older couple seemed to shrink in their chairs. Even Daniel paused mid-motion, pen hovering over the table. The energy in the room shifted completely. The diners weren't witnessing a negotiation anymore. They were witnessing accountability. "I love you," I said, turning my gaze fully on my daughter. "And that is why I am honest with you, even when it's hard. I will continue to support you in ways that are healthy, reasonable, and respectful. But I will not allow you or anyone else to manipulate me. That is my boundary. That is non-negotiable." Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. There was a long pause, long enough for the air to feel heavy with anticipation. Then she looked down at the table, silent. I continued, my voice steady. "Tonight has shown me something important. It has shown me that the person I thought I knew, the one I trusted, the one I believed shared my values, can also make choices that harm our relationship. I am not punishing you. I is naming reality. And I will not participate in anything that violates trust." The room remained still. No one spoke. I could feel eyes on me, some sympathetic, some shocked, some embarrassed. The subtle unease I had felt for weeks, the discomfort, the anticipation, the tension, had finally transformed into clarity. I gathered my own composure and looked at my daughter one last time. "This ends now. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it will be done with honesty, with respect, and with real communication. Not with pressure, not with performances, not with threats. Those are not the tools of love." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She said nothing, not yet. The folder remained closed on the table, a reminder of her intentions. Daniel adjusted his posture, and even the older couple looked like they were reconsidering the narrative they had been quietly supporting. I stood up. The chair scraped lightly against the floor. "I will leave you to reflect on this dinner," I said. "I will not walk away angry, but I will not return to manipulation." No one moved. No one spoke. My daughter's shoulders slumped slightly, and the carefully rehearsed mask she had worn all evening had disappeared entirely. I reached the door and paused. "I love you," I said quietly, so only she could hear. "But love does not mean giving in. Love means setting boundaries. Remember that." Then I walked out. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Behind me, I could hear faint murmurs, the guests processing the confrontation, the tension in the air settling like dust. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of clarity. I had spoken truth, set firm boundaries, and reclaimed control over the situation. And the most important part, the message wasn't just for her. It was for everyone present. Manipulation does not succeed when boundaries are clear, and respect is not optional. That night, as I drove home, I realized something else. Confrontation isn't always loud. It doesn't need shouting or anger. Sometimes it's calm, deliberate, and firm. Sometimes it's holding the line, even when the entire room expects you to fold. And sometimes it's the most powerful way to teach someone the lessons they've been avoiding their entire life. By the time I got home, the weight in my chest had eased slightly. I knew there would be fallout, more conversations, more tension. But I also knew this: I had drawn the line. And no matter how much anyone tried to cross it, I would not step back. Not for guilt, not for pressure, not even for love that disguises itself as entitlement. The drive home after the confrontation was quiet, almost surreal. The city lights blurred past, but my mind wasn't on the streets or traffic. It was on the evening, the dinner, and the daughter I thought I knew. For the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing her clearly, without the lens of hope or imagination clouding my judgment. The person I had raised with love, care, and guidance had shown me a side I hadn't expected, a side that valued manipulation and entitlement over respect and honesty. It didn't feel like anger, not exactly. It was disappointment, heavy and quiet, layered over relief. Relief that I had finally drawn a boundary, relief that I had stood firm. But the disappointment, seeing someone you love act in ways that betray trust, cut deeper than anything else. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for her. The years of working late shifts, skipping vacations, the sleepless nights, the constant effort to provide guidance and security. And yet, those efforts hadn't guaranteed gratitude. They hadn't guaranteed understanding. They hadn't guaranteed that she would make choices that honored the values I tried to instill. The truth hit me. Love and support don't automatically create entitlement-free, morally sound adults. They create individuals with choices, and sometimes those choices reflect more about them than about us. For years, I had assumed my daughter would see the boundaries I set as guidance, as protection, as love. But her actions had reminded me that boundaries are only meaningful if the other person respects them. If they see boundaries as obstacles to their desires, they are no longer tools of care. They are tools of power. The days after the dinner were quiet in a different way. She didn't call. She didn't text. There were no apologies, no attempts to explain, no expressions of regret. I felt the sting of distance again, but this time, I didn't question myself. I knew I had acted with integrity. I knew that giving in would have compromised not just my financial security, but the values I hoped to pass on. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. That was enough. I also realized that the aftermath of confrontation doesn't end with a single night. Relationships, even parent-child ones, are ongoing negotiations of trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Her reaction, or lack thereof, was a reflection of who she had chosen to be in that moment, not a reflection of my worth as a parent. That distinction was crucial. I had to separate her behavior from my self-worth, from my love for her, and from the lessons I had imparted. One of the hardest parts was acknowledging my grief. I grieved the loss of the daughter I thought I had, the one who would understand the value of patience, honesty, and humility. That loss isn't dramatic or sudden. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor. It doesn't erase the love I have, but it reminds me that love alone cannot control the choices of another. At the same time, I found clarity in my own growth. I realized that setting boundaries is not just about self-protection. It is about modeling respect, accountability, and integrity. I showed her, and everyone present, that manipulation will not succeed when met with honesty. That confrontation doesn't require anger or dramatics. It requires calm, firmness, and clarity. And above all, I reminded myself that love sometimes means saying no, even when it hurts, even when it risks distance, even when it's the hardest choice in the world. The most important lesson I took from that night is that relationships cannot thrive on guilt, fear, or coercion. They thrive on mutual respect, clear communication, and trust. My daughter had tested those boundaries, and in doing so, revealed her priorities. I didn't respond with anger, but with firmness, because boundaries are a form of love too. They teach consequences, accountability, and the difference between respect and entitlement. In the weeks since, I focused on reflection. I've thought about the sacrifices I made, the trust I gave, and the lessons I hoped she would internalize. I've realized that parenting is not a guarantee of outcomes. It is a commitment to guidance, protection, and preparation. And sometimes, that guidance requires stepping back, holding firm, and allowing natural consequences to unfold. I still love my daughter. That hasn't changed. But love is no longer blind. It's clearer now, tempered by experience, strengthened by boundaries, and informed by reality. I can offer support without surrendering my integrity. I can love without giving in to manipulation. And I can hope for her growth, for her reflection, and for a future where respect and understanding replace entitlement and strategy. The dinner exposed truths I couldn't ignore. It revealed motivations, intentions, and the reality of our relationship in ways that were painful but necessary. And in that revelation, I found my own strength, my own clarity, and a renewed sense of what love truly means. Love, after all, is not just what you give, it is also what you protect, and what you demand in return. Respect, honesty, and integrity. I never thought saying no to my own daughter would expose the kind of person she'd become. But that dinner changed everything.